Oh, is this going? Wasn't paying attention. All right. Good morning. Good morning. We are on week 2. We are looking at the cardiovascular and the cardiopulmonary system today. Today tends to be a lot of anatomy, a lot of review from A&P1, A&P2, definitely some review from exercise physiology, which all of you should have taken at this point. But before we go on, I'm going to start asking you guys some questions from the article you're supposed to read on fatigue modeling. So that's going to pause any second, and those questions should pop up soon. Okay, so we're starting with the cardiovascular system. So what is the primary role of the cardiovascular system? Well, it's got many roles, right? But our role that we're going to focus on today is delivery of O2 and nutrients, and in part, removal of CO2 and waste products, right? These other roles we're not really focusing on today. Transport of hormones, thermoregulation, pH balance, immune function, right? But specifically 1 and 2 are particularly relevant. Why are they relevant? Well, what did we talk about last week? We talked a lot about bioenergetics, right? And we are heavily reliant on O2, on oxygen, right, for certain bioenergetic processes, right? Beta oxidation, okay? In order for us to metabolize certain substrates, we need O2, right? In order to get O2, we need a strong, right, engine that does all of this pumping, that transportation throughout our body. So what are the components of our cardiovascular system? Right, if you pause this right now, right, give me 4 components of our cardiovascular system. Do a little self-quiz. Pause this video. Well, what are my 4 components? Well, the most obvious one should be your heart, right? Your heart, right, it's the pump. It does all the work, right? You've got your blood vessels. You've got blood, right? Because the blood vessels kind of pump the blood, right? And blood pressure is a component, right, which drives blood flow to the appropriate systems as needed. Okay, so some basic review of heart anatomy. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because this class is not an anatomy and physiology class, but we do have to remember what's going on in the heart. 4 chambers, right? We've got 2 main pumps, right? You've got your pulmonary pump and your systemic pump. What's your pulmonary pump? Well, it's the part or the side, right, that pumps blood to the lungs, right, to get, right, all of the oxygen, right? Your systemic side, right, is the side that pumps it to the body, and that is your left side, right? Your left ventricle is particularly important, right, with regards to pumping everything to the body. It has to be very powerful. We need this very powerful left ventricle, right? Your right and left atria are going to deliver blood to your ventricles, right? From there, your right and left ventricles are delivering blood to the body, okay, or to your lungs. Valves, what are the function of valves, right? The function of valves are simply to prevent backflow of blood, right? Our blood flows unidirectionally. I think we all know the term unidirectional nowadays because every time you walk into a supermarket, right, every time you go into a store, we're supposed to move in a unidirectional way. If you were on campus, right, there's a certain staircase that's meant to just go up, and a certain staircase that's meant to just go down, right? Our valves are there to help us, right, prevent us from going the other direction. Don't worry about the rest of these, not particularly important. So, the layers of the heart wall. Well, what's the most important for us? The most important part of this diagram, right, is your myocardium. So you've got your pericardium, right, which is broken down to many different layers, and that, again, I've taken some of these slides from some of my exercise physiology classes. Don't worry about your pericardium. Your myocardium, right, is the middle and largest layer of the heart, and it is composed of cardiac muscle, right? Your ventricle tends to have a little thicker, right, myocardium, Now, why would this be? Right? Why would your myocardium in endurance athletes be probably thicker than, a sedentary person? Well, because, right, your ventricle is what does the most work. I already said it has to do the most forceful pumping, right? If somebody is, let's say somebody is curling 5 pounds and somebody is curling 50 pounds, right? Your right ventricle is probably the one that's curling 5 or 10 pounds, right? Your left ventricle is the one that's curling 50 pounds, right? So that's going to grow the most because it has to do the most work, right? I oftentimes use the resistance training analogies because a lot of you have had me for resistance training principles, and a lot of you can understand resistance training a little bit more than probably cardiovascular training. Right? So what is the myocardium, right? I already said it's cardiac muscle. Your muscle thickness is going to vary within your own heart, right? I already said that the ventricle, your left ventricle specifically, is always the thickest chamber of the heart, right? It has to pump blood to the entire system of the body, right? Your atria, right? If you think of whether it's your right or your left atria, they simply have to pump the blood down in towards your ventricles. Right, so that pump system doesn't need to be as strong, right? They don't need to stretch, right? Because before our heart, if you guys remember from A&P, right, as it goes through a loading or a filling phase, right, the walls stretch, and then as we contract, right, we pump the blood through that contraction, right? So your atria don't really have to do anywhere near as much work as your ventricles, specifically your left ventricle, right? For this class, why is this important? Well, aerobic exercise places a really high demand on the heart because we need more oxygen for energy, right? And this demand, right, is going to cause hypertrophy to our heart. Just like I gave with the analogy of the 5 to 10 pound dumbbell with the 50-pound dumbbell, right? We're placing a large stimulus on our heart, and it's going to hypertrophize. It's going to go through hypertrophy. I think I just made up a word. What else, right? This should come in as an appearing slide, but what else would cause the heart to hypertrophy? Well, disease, right? Disease. There's certain diseases that are going to elevate our heart rate, okay? And because of this elevated heart rate, the heart's working more, right? It's putting out more force and more power, right? And your heart is going to go through hypertrophy through disease as well. So what are some differences between the cardiac muscle versus your skeletal muscle, the muscle in your heart versus muscle in, your quadriceps, your pectoralis? Well, the main difference is that your heart, regardless of the person, is composed primarily of type 1 muscle fibers, right? Now, those of you that remember exercise physiology, right, we have 2 predominant fiber types, right? We've got type 1 fibers and type 2 fibers. If you remember, type 1 fibers, right, are much smaller. Type 2 fibers are much larger. And one other key difference between our fibers? Well, type 1 fibers are what we would call fatigue resistant. Now, this is obviously important when we're talking about our heart. Since our heart needs to beat all day, we want our heart to be fatigue resistant. So we wouldn't want our heart to be composed of primarily type 2 muscle fibers. Now, having said that, we're primarily type 1 fibers. This means our heart is more aerobically dominant, and it also means that we're going to utilize fat more for energy than we would something like glucose, which our muscles also use, and probably in certain instances are going to use more than the heart. Another major difference is that our heart beats all day. It's not under voluntary control, right? Compared to our muscles, our skeletal muscle fibers, they are under voluntary control. We have to think, we have to send an electrical signal from our brain through our spine to tell our muscles to contract, right? Heart, not so much. Next, our heart, all right, and our myocardium need oxygen and blood, right? So they get this through your coronary arteries, right? Your coronary arteries are highly susceptible to atherosclerosis, which is a narrowing of the arteries from plaque buildup. We've seen research now that shows atherosclerosis can really start happening at the ages of 13, 14, and 15. It's a slow process, and depending on your daily activities and your life choices, some things can speed up that process, like smoking, or can slow that process by making appropriate life decisions through exercise. This is just a picture of the heart to help reinforce some of the concepts we talked about so far, right? So it should show you that on the right side, right, the right atrium and the right ventricle, that is deoxygenated blood, right? There's very little oxygen in that blood. So your right ventricle pumps through your pulmonary artery, right, to the lungs. From there, it comes back to the heart, to the left atrium, and that all of a sudden is now red because it is oxygenated blood. From there, it goes to the left ventricle, and after entering the left ventricle, right, our heart forcefully contracts, and the blood leaves through the aorta and is pumped through the rest of the body. So this is just a picture to help kind of reinforce that understanding, which again should be a rehashing of what you guys have learned over the years in many classes. So now we're talking about the arteries and veins, right? So we finished talking about the heart, right, your engine. Now let's talk about blood flow. So oxygenated blood goes away from the heart, right? So that's kind of the way I think everyone teaches how you remember arteries, right? A away, artery away. Where does it leave the heart? Well, I already told you guys, right? It leaves through the aorta, right? So what's a rare exception to an artery that has blood which is mostly deoxygenated? Right? Your pulmonary artery, right? So you got to remember that your pulmonary artery sends blood to the lungs, right, which is deoxygenated blood. So that's that rare exception to an artery being deoxygenated. But going back to your aorta, right, and your arteries, where within this blood flow system, right, the pressure is much higher. And this should make sense as well, right? Where the pressure is highest through the aorta. And as we get more towards the periphery of your structures, this blood pressure is going to decrease as the walls start to become thinner, right? The farther we get away from the heart, the smaller or thinner the walls become, where our arteries segue into arterioles, and then eventually, right, they segue into capillaries, right? Capillaries are the intermediaries between your veins and your arteries, right, where your walls are incredibly thin, and eventually they are permeable, right? And this is where the exchange of oxygen starts to take place, right, within your capillaries. Once this takes place, right, our capillaries, right, start to enter your venules and eventually your veins, which bring that O2 depleted blood back to your heart. All right. So do we need to know this? Yeah, I mean, this is a lot of a rehashing of kind of what I just said, where there's a large pressure gradient. Pressure is highest in the aorta. So the pressure gradient is the difference, the pressure difference between your aorta and your left ventricle, right, where the pressure is very similar around that area, to your right atria, right, when the blood finally gets back to your heart after traveling throughout your body. And there's this massive pressure gradient. Blood pressure lowers the farther away you get from the heart, I already said. So this slide is mostly just a rehashing of kind of what I just went over with you guys. So up to this point, we've really only talked about one aspect of your heart contracting, and that's really the mechanical component. However, Your heart is a complex, coordinated series of events. In this case, where it really encompasses three different things, it encompasses electrical, chemical, and mechanical. Right, so we're going to go into electrical a little bit next. An electrical signal really tells your heart when to contract. And this cannot be neither too rapid nor too slow. It needs to be kind of just right. The AV node is one of the things that control this. Don't confuse the AV node with the SA node, but we'll talk about the AV node next. Yeah, let's go right into the next slide. So, as I already stated, right, your heart rhythm is incredibly important. It cannot be too fast or too slow, right? And what really dictates that the heart rhythm is really your SA node and your AV node. Your SA node being the pacemaker. It's what initiates the electrical signal. But really before the electrical signal can get down to the rest of the heart, it needs to kind of be cleared by the AV node. It delays the signal until it's the appropriate time to release it. Once it releases it, right, that electrical signal is sent down the AV bundle. I personally like to think of the SA and the AV node almost like the heart itself, right? That engine almost. And then the AV bundle really is almost like the arteries, where that signal starts to branch out a little bit, just like the arteries start to branch out. From the AV bundle, right, the Purkinje fibers branch out to the terminal ends. And I like to think of these as almost like the capillaries, where the Purkinje fibers are really what signal, right, that electrical reaction to take place, and it's really going to signal the contraction to take place. I think I have a picture next. There you go, right? So you see you've got your AV node, right? From your AV node, we connect to the AV bundle. As that branches down, we have a left and right bundle branch, and then it branches out to your Purkinje fibers. All right, so we're moving on to the respiratory system. For the respiratory system, right, we could think of the components of it as your airway, your lungs, and your respiratory muscles. And the goal of your respiratory system is to provide an exchange of O2 and CO2. We don't really need to go through the sequence of events. We understand how we breathe through our nose, through our trachea. That's not quite as important. We need to understand the respiratory process. That's the important part. How do I breathe? Inhalation, inspiration, I use them interchangeably, is where we bring O2 rich air into the lungs, not lunges, into the lungs. Exhale, expiration is where O2 depleted air is removed from the lungs, right? Then you've got your internal respiration and external respiration. Internal is where gas exchanges at the rest of the body, right? External is where gas exchange occurs at the lungs, right? So internal respiration is within the rest of the body. External respiration is within the lungs. Another depiction of kind of what really is going on, right? So we breathe through our mouth or our nose. From our mouth and our nose, the air enters our trachea, right? And then our pharynx. And eventually it enters our thoracic cavity, right? Our thoracic cavity, which really houses our hearts, houses the lungs and the heart. So how do we determine our lung health and our lung capacity? Well, we've got to learn a few more terms, one being spirometry, right? And it's a technique used to assess our ability to respire, right? And it measures lung volumes. Some other key terms would be tidal volume, right? And that's the volume of air inspired and expired with each breath. Your inspiratory reserve volume is the amount of air that we can maximally inhale. Expiratory reserve volume, conversely, is the opposite. And your residual volume, right, is the amount of air remaining in your lungs after we exhale. Our lungs have to always have some sort of air, because if we had no air left, our lungs would actually collapse, right? So we need to have that residual volume after we go through maximal exhalation. So, what factors influence breathing? Well, arterial pressure of our arteries actually is going to be one of the main factors that influences our breathing. So we have two things: our arterial pressure of carbon dioxide and our arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide and partial pressure of oxygen, right? So an example I give is let's say we start to exercise. As we start to exercise, right, the partial pressure of our carbon dioxide in our arteries is going to increase, right? So within our arteries, right, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide increases as we exercise. The partial pressure of O2 decreases, right, as we start to exercise. This also causes a decrease in pH, right? And because of this, right, these changes in these partial pressures, these are interpreted by things we call chemoreceptors. Right? These chemoreceptors are going to understand what is going on and send a message to our brain which says, hey, right, our CO2 is going up, we really need more oxygen, we need to breathe faster. And that's going to increase what we call minute ventilation. Right? So as the partial pressure of CO2 increases, we start to breathe faster. All right, breathing mechanics. So for ventilation, it's really the summation of both inspiration and expiration. And our ventilation really changes based on our activity level. At rest, right, ventilation is a fairly passive process. Expiration is entirely passive, right? It requires very little energy. Inspiration, on the other hand, there is some energy in that our diaphragm has to contract to expand our lungs. As our lungs expand, the pressure decreases below the atmospheric pressure, and this change in pressure allows, right, the air to flow from a high to low. So as our lungs expand, the pressure decreases, right, within our lungs, and the air pressure is always going to go from high to low, just like our heart, right, where we talked about a pressure gradient, right? There's a pressure gradient, and pressure is always going to go from high to low. As we exercise, right, things change slightly, where it's not just our diaphragm that is now working to expand our lungs. Our scalenes and our sternocleidomastoid have to pull up the rib cage for further expansion. Your external intercostals are going to also help pull the rib cage out. Now, expiration, which is done normally at rest fairly passively, right? Air has to be pushed out forcefully. So it's not this passive process anymore, right? And all of a sudden, right, your internal intercostals and your abdominal wall have to contract to forcefully push this air out. We want to decrease the chest volume. Okay. So what is the whole point of everything we've talked about so far? It always comes back to function in this class. All right. The purpose for the heart, right, is to transport oxygen and nutrients to the rest of the body, to the working muscles, and to remove both waste products and CO2. Right? In order to transport O2 and nutrients, right, they are transported via red blood cells. So blood itself isn't just red blood cells. It really is composed of two parts. It's composed of hematocrit, those containing red blood cells, and plasma, that part not containing red blood cells. Of our blood, right, it's composed approximately 35 to 45% hematocrit, depending on your source, depending on the person, and this could change, and the rest being plasma, right? Actual O2 is transported through hemoglobin, which is only contained in hematocrit. So our blood plasma isn't really transporting O2. So here's a hierarchy of events, right? So after blood goes to the lungs, comes back to the heart, is at the left ventricle, or after it's at the left atria, excuse me. Then it has to be pumped through the bicuspid valve to the left ventricle. right? From the left ventricle, you've got your O2 rich blood that is pumped to the arteries and the skeletal system. Once this O2 rich blood, right, enters the skeletal system, it can start to diffuse through the capillaries to enter our skeletal muscle. Once it enters skeletal muscle, right, it can be used via the mitochondria for what? Bring it all back to last week, beta oxidation, right, or some forms of glycolysis, right? We need O2 for some forms of bioenergetics. So for next week, I'm going to give you guys 2 articles. One is just a short news article on a marathon endurance runner who passed away, I don't know, in the early 2000s while running a marathon. His name's Ryan Shea. It's obviously a sad story, but it's a story for us to, it's an opportunity for us to increase our understanding of the risks associated with endurance sports. A second article is a peer-reviewed article on respiratory muscle endurance training, right? It's something that's pretty cool that you guys, if you're ever getting into endurance sports, something you guys might want to look into. So those questions will start next week's presentation.